Hello, I'm Earl Wilson. Today we're going to begin phase 2 of our Especially for Men series and talk about the upward and outward phase. We go downward and inward in terms of understanding ourselves, understanding some of our emotions, but then reach a point where there are specific things that we have to change, specific things that have to be different if we're going to live a life that's free of pornography and free of sexual sin. The topic for today is thinking errors. People who are caught in dealing with pornography or having affairs or whatever are always asked the question, what were you thinking? And they probably ask themselves that question a lot of times. And the answer that they usually give is an incorrect answer. Because the answer that they usually give is, I wasn't thinking. And that is incorrect because it's a half-truth at best. Carrying out a life of subterfuge, carrying out a life of a double life requires lots of thought, requires planning. I remember the first time I said to my therapist, Dan, I don't understand why I'm so impulsive. And he looked at me with amazement and said, you're one of the most planful people that I know. I don't think you hardly do anything out of impulse. And that changed the course of things for me, because then I had to really begin to evaluate the thinking that I had. My daughter said to me at the time she first learned of what I'd done, she said, Dad, I can't understand how you, knowing all that you know, could have done all the things that you did. She asked exactly the right question. But you know, the truth is it had nothing to do with knowledge. It had to do with desire. It had to do with curiosity. It had to do with uncontrolled fantasy. And so understanding the deterioration that's taken place in your thinking and then being able to evaluate your thinking. What normally happens, I believe, is that the upper brain is disengaged once a person starts to pursue a pornographic lifestyle. You no longer run things through the cognitive part of your brain, because that's where the evaluation part of it is. If you were evaluating, then you'd be thinking about, well, what impact is this going to have on my wife? How will this impact my children? What if my employer finds out? To show you just how distorted my thinking was, I remember vividly being in a nude bar for lunch, and I saw a man that I knew. And I said to myself, I'll never come here again, it's too dangerous. But I did. 2 days later, I was in the same place. Was I thinking? Obviously not, except thinking about the feelings that I wanted to experience, thinking about the curiosity, but not doing the kind of thinking that is necessary if one is going to get their life back under control. My experience with myself and my experience with clients is that thinking deteriorates the more involved a person gets in a pursuit of a negative behavior. So if you're pursuing pornography on the internet, you're not going to think about the consequences. And your thinking is going to be deteriorating even more, because you'll tell yourself some lies. Like, well, this isn't really hurting anybody. Or one I think is just as bad, this isn't hurting anyone but me. Why should you think it's okay to hurt yourself? And it's interesting because I deal a lot with Christian men, and I asked him, well, did you ever ask God what he thinks about this? And they say, oh no, I would never do that. Well, of course you wouldn't do that. because to ask God would mean that you'd have to hear the answer, and if you heard the answer, it would change the course of the decisions that you were going to make. So when I first started seeing my therapist, he said, I want you to make a list of the lies that you're telling yourself. And I said, I'm not telling myself any lies. And he says, oh, yes, you are. And I said, give me some examples. And he gave me a couple examples. When I got through making the list, I had discovered 14 thinking errors. These I listed in my book, Steering Clear, so if you want a detail of them, you can look that up in the book. But the point is that our thinking, negative thinking, our thinking errors dominate. And probably one of the first ones that comes up is the whole area of minimization. We tell ourselves, well, that's not so bad. Well, I often ask myself and my clients, it's not so bad. Well, what are you saying? You didn't murder anyone? No one died, at least on the outside. Who knows how they died on the inside? So the whole question of the thinking errors is something that needs to be addressed. And there are some specific ones that are really important to keep in mind. One that I think of is a person that says, as I did many times, no one will ever know. Of course they'll know. There are very few things this day and age that people don't know about other people. Or they're telling themselves, if I don't tell, no one will ever find out. Well, I discovered how fallacious that argument was when I realized that God had said, be sure your sins will find you out. And in fact, that came true in that particular time. So understanding your thinking errors and then beginning to deal with them, beginning to evaluate them, beginning to challenge them. This is a key place to start. Once you identify some of those thinking errors, then you need to be aware of when they come up, and you need to challenge them immediately when you experience them. In other words, by saying, wait a minute, that's not true, or that's a half-truth. And I remember talking to a client and asking him a question about some of his behavior. This particular person had an obsession, what I called a breast obsession. He wanted to see female breasts. And I said, what's that supposed to do for you? And he turned white. He said, I've never thought of that before. And I said, well, is there some huge benefit in that? I said, would that be the first time you've ever had that experience? Well, no. Well, it's time then you start asking yourself some of the hard questions. And the way you deal with thinking errors is, first of all, to identify them, to name them, if you will, and say, okay, this is what I tell myself, and it's wrong. Things like, no one will ever know. Or I almost forgot one of my favorites. One of my favorites is the person that says, well, this next time will be the last time. And when a client would tell me that, I would start to laugh at him. And I'd say, when was that ever true? And almost always the same response would be, yeah, I have told myself that quite a few times, and it's never been the last time. So we decided that the best way to challenge that would be to say, the last time was the last time, and so now I need to get this thought out of my mind. So I encourage you to, first of all, learn about your thinking errors. There's lots of good literature out there to learn to challenge your thinking errors and then to replace them with right kind of thinking. One of my clients says, if I play it forward, that means I'm thinking about the consequences. And to think about the consequences, you're not using your lower brain, you're using upper brain, because that's where the cognitive part of us is served. Lower brain is stimulus response, upper brain in general. Upper brain is where the cognitive functions are. So I encourage you to think about the ways in which you justify the lies that you tell, the things that you do, And immediately the denial response to that is, well, I don't justify anything. Oh, yes, we all do. We justify everything that we do. We tell ourselves something that allows us to engage in those behaviors, even though if we used our upper brain, we'd know better. So ever since my daughter challenged me in the way she did, I've tried to employ all the brain that God has given me so that my behavior can honor Him and certainly show honor and respect to my family.